Bernard-Henri Lévy, welcome to the Dispatch podcast.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you for joining us. Many of us in America, even listeners of the Dispatch who are more attuned to the news than usual, are only casual followers of French politics. And it's moments like this when we become a little bit more attuned. So maybe to begin with, if you wouldn't mind, maybe just give a recap of how you see what just occurred in the French elections from your perspective.
In a few words, because I'm not sure it is so important. More important is what is happening in Israel and in Ukraine. But in France, what happened is that half of the country is on the line of the worst populist parties, right-wing and left-wing, populist, anti-Semite, pro-Putin, and this is a little half of the country, divided into two, the party of Marine Le Pen and the party of Jean-Luc Mélenchon.
And we will get into Israel and Ukraine a little bit. But one of the headlines that caught my attention before the election was in the AP. It read, "Renowned Nazi hunter in France advises Jews to choose the far right over the far left elections." Serge Klarsfeld went on to say the far left party, led by the Unbowed Party, is a violently anti-Israel party with anti-Semitic overtones, and that he believes, despite its past history with Le Pen and its founding, that the far right was preferable over the far left if that was your option in your district. It also quoted you as disagreeing with him. How do you view that option? What when you saw him come out and say that, what was your calculus looking at this election between the far left and the far right?
I don't calculate, I feel. First of all, the whole left is not anti-Semitic. A part of left, La France Insoumise, the unbowed France, which is in reality bowed. They are slaves, La France Insoumise, of they are close to Putin, to Iran, to Syria of Bashar al-Assad. So they are the most bowed of all parties, but they are anti-Semitic. These ones, this part of the left, this extreme left today, is a real, proper anti-Semitic party. This is clear. And an anti-Semitism which is not hidden, which is pure, which is assertive. On the other side, you have the extreme right, who has a long tradition of anti-Semitism. Long tradition. They were founded. The party was created by former Nazis or French collaborators with the Nazis. They pretend to have broken with this tradition. I doubt. Myself, I doubt. Why do I doubt? Because I know what is French anti-Semitism. It's a heavy thing. You don't get rid of that just like this, by decision, by decree, by caprice, by a decision of your political bureau. It needs to get rid of a deeply rooted anti-Semitism, deeply embedded in your DNA. It needs a real work, a deep one, a deep work on yourself, a work of memory, a work of mourning, a work of remorse, whatever. This work was not done by the extreme right. So, in other terms, we Jews have the choice between an open anti-Semitism, which is extreme left of La France Insoumise, and a hidden anti-Semitism, and sometimes popping out in many circumstances, of the extreme right wing, Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella. This is, alas, the choice. In the middle, we have a strong center bloc who is still, hopefully, thanks God, governing my country.
The left, as you mentioned, you don't believe is entirely anti-Semitic, but the largest party of that coalition, France Unbowed, excuse my pronunciation, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Is that close enough? He himself has been accused of anti-Semitism, refuses to refer to Hamas as a terrorist organization. I think he did a rally before the election with a fellow party member who justified the October 7th attacks, has made statements referring to Jews killing Jesus, called French organizations arrogant, Jewish organizations arrogant. Have you met him, and do you believe him personally to be an anti-Semite?
I did not meet him recently, but I met him a long time ago. And I think he changed in the last years. And I think he is an anti-Semite. It is not just, as French commentators often say, it is not just a calculation, not just a Machiavellian tactic. It is a really, genuinely rooted and embedded anti-Semitism, not just a protest anti-Semitism. This man, Mélenchon, you spell it well, and his guys around there. When you say that the CRIF, which is our IPAC, is the real master of French politics and threads the strings of French politics, it is anti-Semitism. When you say, as one of his partners in politics, Mrs. Hassan, when you say that the Jews in Israel train dogs in order to rape Palestinians, what is it if not a fake news which is pure anti-Semitism? And there are many examples. Not only, of course, the fact of to refuse to name Hamas terrorist, of course, the denial of October 7th, but much worse than that. You have so many stories of pure, infuriated, angry, horrible anti-Semitism coming from that side. That's true. They are anti-Semitic.
I did a little bit of a deep dive into what happens next in French politics, because I didn't know what would happen when you have roughly a third, not quite each equal, the left party a little bit more, a third of the seats in different parties. I guess one option is a stalemate. One option is for a coalition. Would you recommend that President Macron refuse to have a coalition with either the right or the left? Or how do you imagine this proceeding?
I beg and pray President Macron not to accept any coalition with the anti-Semites of La France, of the France unbowed, for sure. They cannot be part of a coalition. It would be a shame to have them in the government. And same for the extreme right. It would be a shame to have them in the government also, not only for the Jews, but also other minorities in France, also French politics in general. They are absolute amateurs. They are absolutely in the hand of Vladimir Putin and of the enemies of France, I mean the extreme right. And no question, they have to be also out of the coalition. But there is much space in the middle. Between Le Pen and Mélenchon, there is a lot of people with whom President Macron can coalesce.
So you believe you'll be able to form a majority without having to go to the far right or the far left?
I'm sure he can. I'm sure there is the possibility for President Macron and for France to build a majority without these two crazy, non-decent parties.
Do you think that's what he's going to try to do?
I suppose. I guess. I hope.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, as an outsider who's kind of doing a deep dive in the last 2 days, how about the regular right? Why do they get so little support? It seems that they have somewhat more normal views. why are they, especially for someone who's center right in the U.S., why are they so weak? Why don't they get more support than they do?
Yeah, and not only good ideas, but they have great people. You have great decent people in the French right, like in the Grand Old Party in America. You have still some no Trump people
Right.
who are faithful to the best of the tradition of the party of Ronald Reagan and others. So, in the same situation as in America, in France, you have a sort of plague of extremism, of populism, which is devouring, eating the French right. And this devoration, this contamination, this plague left a few dozens, maybe 58 or 59 decent ladies and guys who are faithful to the inner heritage of General de Gaulle, of Alexis de Tocqueville, of the good right-wing tradition. But they are overwhelmed by the huge tide, the huge wave, as in America, of the crazy bullshit of the extremes.
I want to delve into these issues a little later in the podcast outside of French politics. But within French politics, within this question of what happens next as they relate to France's position on Israel-Gaza, as it relates to France's position on Ukraine, how does the election affect where France will stand on international affairs?
It will not affect because France has a way of governing which is relying for one half on the parliament and for one half on the president. And the half which is in the hands of the president is precisely foreign policy. Foreign policy is a sort of reserved ground, domaine réservé, reserved, a gated part of policy, which is under the responsibility of the president, whatever is the governing coalition. So, even if tomorrow, by bad curse, Macron had to call Hôtel Matignon, Madame Le Pen or Mr. Mélenchon, even in that case, which is the worst, he will keep for himself he will remain commander-in-chief of the armies, and he will keep for himself Ukraine and the Gaza, the war in Gaza.
Speaking of Jews in France, I remember in 2015 in The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, now editor-in-chief, wrote a piece. Is it time for Jews to leave Europe? Looking specifically at France, there was an article recently. Rabbi Moshe Seabag from this Grand Synagogue of Paris told the Times of Israel that he thought that France has no future for Jews. What is your views of Jews in France? Is France become a place where if you are Jewish in France, you have to start thinking about another place to live?
No, it's not time to leave. It's time to fight, time to resist, time to erect barricades, mental barricades, intellectual barricades, political barricades, but not to leave. French Jews have in part built France. They are among the best architects of France, the Jews. Are they going? Are we going? Am I going to live and to let to those crazy analphabet, illiterate morons, anti-Semites, this great and beautiful country? No way, no way. This country is ours, much more than theirs. You know, they are unfaithful to any tradition of France. The Jews are embedded with the 19th century, the French Revolution, the time of the kings. In all that, Jews were in the center of the game, in the center of the architecture. They cannot leave the ground to this stupid, moronic mob. Impossible.
Let me ask you about immigration, which I think was an animating issue of this election and a lot of elections in Europe and in the United States as well. In the U.S., someone like me who's kind of a pro-immigrant, right of center figure, believes that immigration is good, has had this concept that it's different in America than in Europe, or at least it's a common thought. Because in America, it's easier to assimilate into America because America is an idea. Is it an issue to assimilate into France in particular if you're an immigrant? Is it easy to be considered a Frenchman if you're a recent immigrant? Is that a difference in France?
Same. France is an ID too. America and France are among the few countries in the world which are not just another country. France and America have in common to be based on a creed. America has a creed. France has a creed. And to embrace a creed is difficult, but not impossible. It's difficult because you have to mean it, you have to want it, you have to embrace it really. But it's always possible. Number one. And number two, it happens in France. The press makes its headlines about those who don't embrace the French creed. But the majority of the migrants in France embrace the creed. Still now.
So is that issue in your mind in France, the immigration issue that rallied the far right to doing better than it had previously done? Is that an overwrought issue, or what do you make? What should we understand in America of the issue of immigration in France?
You know, the country, the parts of the country where the pro right-wing vote were the most high, were often parts where there is no migrants. I could quote you many areas of France where extreme right arrived beyond more than first plus, and then the voters never saw migrants in their village or in their town. So it's a fantasy very often. And by the way, in the big cities where you have a lot of migrants, they did not make such a good score, the extreme right. The left made a good score in the big cities. So the question of migrants is really made up, instrumentalized, made like hot and high cream by the militants of the far right. Of course, all issues are issues, and immigration has to be controlled when there are laws who have to be applied, and so on and so on. But it is not the main reason from far for this vote for the extremes.
Last question about the election, and then I want to talk to you a little bit about Ukraine in Israel-Gaza. There have been, at least in the economic news in the U.S., the economic news stations, discussions of what happens if the left has a strong role to play in economic policy. I think France Unbowed has talked about putting a 90% rate on some income level. They haven't specified it, but in the past, that income level was about $450,000 in American dollars, which seems like that might cause a lot of French capital or French businessmen to consider relocating. Is that a worry at all? The economic toll this election might play on France, and where some of French's top business people might end up deciding to emigrate elsewhere?
Certainly, that's another reason why I don't think that the extreme left will be governing France. It's unthinkable. Their program is absolutely surrealistic, has no sense. It means suicide for the country. It would mean suicide for the country. And so would have had, by the way, the right-wing program. The Le Pen program would have meant the same. And by the way, the two are very similar. Their economic program are very similar. going out of Europe, uh, raising up the lowest salaries without any way of making it part of a general economic program. They are very similar.
It's sometimes not noticed in the U.S. The far right in France is actually closer to a liberal leftist program in terms of economy in the United States.
Economically, it is the same. And in foreign policy, it is the same also. The two extremes said the same. Anti-America, anti-NATO, anti-West, pro-Putin, pro-Bashar al-Assad, etc., etc. On main topics of economics or diplomacy, they agreed. And we might discover that, by the way, in the next parliament when the real issues and real proper laws come to be voted.
Let me ask you about Ukraine, an issue that you care a great deal about. I believe you visited at least once, maybe several times. It seems like it's somewhat of a stalemate now, and also a question of how much the West will continue to support Ukraine. What do you think should happen next? What do you think will happen next in this fight between Ukraine and Russia?
I was not in Ukraine a few times. I spent most of my time in the last 2 years in Ukraine. I made 3 documentary films and so on. So what will happen, I don't know. What must happen, I can tell you. What must happen is the victory of Ukraine and the defeat of Putin. If this does not happen, it will be the worst case scenario for Europe and for America. If tomorrow there is a peace in the words and terms of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, you can say bye-bye to Taiwan. And Chinese can say welcome to Taiwan, China. So for the world, there is an absolute need of a victory for Ukraine.
Do you think there is a path to victory at this point? And what is that path?
The path to victory, you say? The path.
Path, sorry.
Path,
yeah.
path. The path to victory is weapons. Weapons. Iron domes for the cities, which are not protected, which means close the sky, number one. You saw yesterday there were 2 children hospitals destroyed in Ukraine, two hospitals and one of children in Kiev. This would not have happened if we had delivered since 2 years and a half the anti-missile Patriot or whatever able to stop that, number one, and offensive weapons. So there is an agreement at last signed by President Biden and by President Macron and by other prime ministers and presidents in Europe. But now it has to be implemented. F-16 have to come. Long-range missiles have to be sent in emergency. It's urgent.
Can I ask a broader question? I've been following your work since I was a college student in 2005 in the Atlantic, when you wrote the pieces on the U.S., kind of the second to Tocqueville. And I think, to your credit, you always are on the side of the West against dictators, against evil. I wonder how you would respond, I guess, to what the critics might argue. Critics who would agree with you on the good versus evil aspect, but would say, maybe either the limits of American power or Western power, or take away the limits of the power portion, Western attention, Western concern, Western ability to stay the course. And I would point to Libya, for instance, where we fight and then we leave and it devolves into madness. And even Afghanistan, after 20 years of fighting the good fight, you might say, leaving and then seeing the enemies come back into power, that I guess to make it a finer point, you might be right in terms of good versus evil and what should be done in a perfect world. But if you take into calculus of the Western attention to these conflicts, much less ability to fight them, sometimes intervening without that support, that long-term support to get the job done, might be the worst solution than trying to find some accommodation with even evil.
No, to find some accommodation with evil is certainly the worst. In moral terms, in political terms, in real politics terms, in terms of national defense for America, for Europe, accommodation with the evil is the worst, because we prove to be weak and coward, and without any word. Our word don't mean anything. Afghanistan, for example, is a good example of that, because we did not only wage a war, as you said, but we won the war. In Afghanistan, I know it well. I was in Afghanistan a few months before the retreat of America. I was there. I saw how, with just a few thousands boots on the ground, much less than in Australia, in Qatar, or in Germany, you Americans, with much less soldiers, you achieved the incredible goal to have the Taliban going underground, the ladies to go unveiled in the streets, a generation of journalists to appear and to develop, and a civil society to be built. You Americans, and a little us Europeans before, we made that. We were in the process of winning. It is not that we failed. I always see Afghanistan in the list of the failed wars of America. It's not true. This one, you won it. Few soldiers, again, much less than everywhere else. In the last year or year and a half, no casualties in the American troops, and a huge effect on society. I saw that. I could, a few months before, I could circulate, I could go and walk, and from one city to another. I made a reportage for Wall Street Journal. You can find it online. It was really, it was going in the good sense. And suddenly, you had a Donald Trump plan implemented by Joe Biden, which result was a shame for all of us and for all our friends. Before that, the Kurds in Syria. This was Donald Trump alone, not Biden. Kurds in Syria, withdrawal of the American troops. Again, you had so few. What was the message? When a few American troops withdrew, it meant to Turkey, bon appétit, good appetite, Mr. Erdogan. And before that, the Kurds in Iraq, who were our best allies in the area except Israel. Apart from Israel, our best allies. They shed their blood for us in the fight against ISIS. Same. We thought we did not need them any longer, and we wash our hands. Go to hell. They made a referendum, and the state secretary of that time, Rex Tillerson, told them, do whatever you want, we will not support. This is bad policy. Bad policy. Accommodation, compromise, withdrawal, cowardness, lack of word. This is the worst policy for a great power.
Let me just play devil advocate for a second, not necessarily my position, but as it applies to Ukraine. If Ukraine feels that they don't have the West's full support and won't get more weapons and can't achieve a total victory, do you think it's reasonable for them to say at some point, freeze the conflict where it is, or do they need to go forward and fight to the last man? Because I mean, the death toll on both sides has been enormous.
I will never say to anyone, especially a friend, go and fight till the last dead. Certainly not. They are fighting for them, and they are fighting for you and me, for us. So what I say is that we have to support them. If we stopped supporting them, then it would be another thing. But I will certainly not advise to a Masada strategy for the Ukrainians. Certainly not. No. For the moment, they have the moral, the political, and the strategic support of their American allies. This support just has to be implemented and has to become concrete. So let's do it. Let's plead for that.
Let me ask you about Israel. There's an interesting dichotomy that there are some people the same people who sometimes want to support Ukraine to total victory, want Israel to stop when they have a more likelihood of achieving total victory than potentially Ukraine, given their strength versus their enemy. Why do you think that is? Those who want to see Ukraine achieve victory against the evil that is Putin seem to sometimes want to call Israel to stop trying to achieve total victory against what is at least as great of evil, if not worse, in Hamas.
For the best, in the best case scenario, it is inconsistency, and the worst case scenario, it is anti-Semitism. That's it. Inconsistency because you are right. What we want for Ukraine, we should want for Israel. Same. It is two front lines of the same war. Ukraine patriots and Israeli fighters are dealing against the same enemy. Hamas, Iran, Putin. This is the same axis. So it is totally inconsistent not to understand that. And in many cases, I cannot calibrate. I don't know. It is pure anti-Semitism. They are fed up with Jews, fed up with Israel, blah, 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 blah.
Let me ask one final political question before going to a few closing questions, which are quick and I think fun. Do you have any thoughts on the American election coming up, Donald Trump versus Joe Biden? I think you just criticized both of their Afghan policies. What do you make of the choice that America faces in a few months?
It's the first time in my life, when I would not like to be American. It's really a bad choice. Biden has acted bravely since the last 3 years. In Ukraine, evident, he woke up suddenly after Afghanistan, after the first days of the war in Ukraine, when he gave a permit to go to Putin. Suddenly he woke up. He was great. A great Biden appeared. A great Biden for Israel also. At the end of the day, the alliance keeps strong, but it's very sad to say, but he has obviously turned into a sort of Shakespearean king, wandering in his haunted castle, unknowing sometimes, apparently, who he is and what are the stakes. And on the other side, Donald Trump, though he did a few good things, I cannot forget the Abraham Accords agreements, I cannot forget the American embassy in Jerusalem, but on the whole, at the end of the day again, he's the worst choice, one of the worst choices for America. Very bad choice. Populist, pro-Putin, acting. I remember the images of him with Kim Jong-un, the chief of Korea, who were so childish and so dangerous for the world. So, first time in my life, I always dreamt to be an American, except maybe now.
Elad, I want to follow up on that before I go to the closing broader questions, because it kind of ties into our previous. You mentioned the Abraham Accords, which I also thought were great. And I mentioned earlier, and I don't know if I love the term I use, but the accommodation with evil. in a sense, I think Saudi Arabia has had variations of evil forms of government. Maybe it's getting a little better than it once was, but in a way, isn't that an accommodation with I think what you would see is not a nice form of government, an evil form of government.
Of course, it is not Saudi Arabia. I know that it is. You have torture, political prisoners, freedom of speech really harmed, and so on and so on. But what you can say is that Saudi Arabia is slowly or quickly, I think slowly, moving out of that. Saudi Arabia is not in a process of enclosing itself in its own bad past, but trying to stem out from that. And this is also another consideration you have to have. If you make an alliance with a country which is not your type, which is not your sort, which is not your family. It is a quote of Marcel Proust at the end of La Recherche du Temps Perdu. He said, all of that for a woman qui n'était pas mon genre, who was not my type. Okay, Saudi Arabia is not our type. You Americans, us French. But it is stemming out of the cold, out of the dark, out of the worst, rather steadily. And this, I think that it is not a compromise with the devil to try to escort this movement, to help this movement, to accompany this movement. I think that's good politics.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Let me close with final three kind of fun questions. Can you point to 3 books that most shaped your worldview?
Very difficult. No, I couldn't.
Okay. Is there a historical
maybe Hemingway, For Whom the Bell Tolls. This is the English title. I read it in French. For Whom the Bell Tolls. Voilà. Pour qui sonne le glas. For Whom the Bell Tolls in Israel. For us, French and American. For Whom the Bell Tolls in Kharkiv today. For us, American and French. For whom the bell tolls when Syrian Kurdish are killed by Erdogan, again for us.
Is there a historical leader that you most admire?
Winston Churchill, for sure. Oh, so smart, so brave.
And finally, just out of curiosity, what American writers do you, and political writers, do you read and like? Who do you admire? Whose thought do you admire in the U.S.?
The living writers, you mean? Or
yes.
Living. There are some American or English writers at this moment whom I admire. On Israel, for example, he's not American, but he is living in America. Someone who did a real great job is Douglas Murray. We don't agree. We don't agree on many other points, but on Israel, I must say that I can't wait for the book I'm sure he's working on. I can't wait for it. It will be great, and it might be a game changer. I admire in America, for example, on other matters, and even about France, an American writer who is Adam Gopnik. He's working in the New Yorker. And he's probably your best observer and specialist of European policy and of the special link which unite you, US, and us, Europe and France. These are 2 names who come to my mind, but it's a difficult exercise because there are so many, Niall Ferguson, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, so many.
Final follow up, because I did think of Douglas Murray when I was about to interview today, and I wonder, do you see a little bit of you in him in the sense that he too goes to war zones? I mean, he's always flocking to Ukraine or Israel-Gaza for his commentary, and I think a little bit about. I mean, that you always see you in Libya or various places.
You said it, and we were together in Ukraine. By the way, we shared the 1 year and a half ago, I think, 1 year and a half, yes, when Kherson was retaken by the Ukrainians. We were, Douglas and myself, I think, among the first foreign observers to enter into liberated Kherson, and we were together. We shared the same fixers, the same cars, and we shared the same brotherhood on the ground in Ukraine.
But Bernard-Henri Lévy, thank you for joining the Dispatch podcast.
Thanks to you.